2026 national and local elections. Labour has moved from a historic landslide general election victory to a historic by-election defeat in just a year and a half. There's been no shortage of opinions on how Labour should respond, but not enough attention has been paid to the UK's biggest swing voter demographic, women, who are much more likely to make up their mind closer to the polling day at the last election. This is nothing new. Conditions for women deteriorated under the Conservatives because they were more exposed to austerity. And we're now witnessing a global backlash against gender equality. Labour has taken decisive action to correct course on a number of fronts, such as childcare and workers' rights. But the question remains, do women feel heard and supported enough to turn out for Labour at the next election? Today's session will explore this topic in two parts. First, we'll look at the things that women will care about in the next election. That'll be a session that takes place between 6:30 and 7:10. We'll then break for 5 minutes before having an in-person conversation with Sonia Kumar MP, and then turn to the next panel, which is how should Labour campaign strategy be tailored to win women's votes? Each session will comprise a short 3-minute contribution from panelists, followed by a moderated discussion and Q&A with questions. We encourage people to post questions in the chat. I'll be chairing the first session before turning to my esteemed Fabian Women's Network executive sister, who is also on the Regional Executive Committee for Community Trade Union, and will then chair the second panel. So we'll now move on to the first panel to kick things off, which is what will women be thinking about as they head to the polls in May. With me, I have some excellent women, some of the best and brightest in the Labour movement. An enormous privilege to welcome Jade Azim. Jade is the head of policy and advocacy at the Good Growth Foundation, and is the founder of Women in Political Data, and will be talking us through the latest polling. Next, we have Dr. Daniela Jenkins. Dr. Jenkins is the new director of the Women's Budget Group, which is a feminist think tank that analyses economic policies through a gendered lens and advocates for gender equality in policy making. I had the pleasure of giving evidence alongside Dr. Jenkins to the Work and Pensions Select Committee about a year ago. And finally, bringing the youth perspective is Ruby Herbert. Ruby, until recently, was the chair of Labour Students. I'm very much looking forward to hearing her take on kind of how what Labour's kind of offer should look like across different generations. Like I say, we were due to be joined by Sonia Kumar MP, the MP for Dudley and PPS, to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury for this panel. She unfortunately is delayed due to parliamentary business. She will be joining us, but only from around 7:15. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I'm really looking forward to a thought-provoking conversation. So I'm going to kick things off by inviting contributions from our panelists, starting with Jade Azim from the Good Growth Foundation. Jade, over to you.
Thank you, and so much for having me. An immediate advanced apologies if you hear my cats screaming in the background. I tried to kick them out, but they got themselves back into the room. So for those that don't know us, the Good Growth Foundation also has in-house polling. So we're a think tank, but we also have the benefit of frequently polling voters and doing focus groups with voters. And of course, as a part of that, we always look at the gender breakdown. You'll find that, particularly for young women, that actually, first of all, they obviously share a lot of the same issues and concerns as the general populace. But they're actually, as Saskia pointed out, a genuine swing constituency, except that our political discourse right now really, really does focus on the angry man discourse. So this idea that actually, if you think about a dissenting voter, it is a bloke down a pub getting angry about immigration. But actually, when you poll women, particularly 18 to 34 year olds, what you find is they are also very dissenting. It just happens to be on the left of politics. So they are predominantly looking towards the radical left. So something like 30% of young men in that demographic are considering voting reform. Almost identically, 29% of young women are considering voting for the Greens. Um, this falls to 9% for young men. And then versus that as well, 9% of women are only considering voting for reform. So there's almost a paradoxical but equally dissenting tug of war happening there. And when you ask this same demographic of women what their top three issues are, it is the economy, it is health, and it is housing. If you ask young men, it is the economy, it is crime, and it is immigration. So our politics, I think, factors quite considerably those latter three issues and really, really does pay attention to that sort of angry discourse around crime and immigration in particular. But we really do oversee the significant differences amongst young women as a demographic, where they care mostly about health, housing, and the economy at large. This is a key switcher demographic that Labour really has to pay heed to, and also focus on the fact that populism has many colours, and for young women, it is predominantly green.
Thank you, Jade. That was incredibly interesting and insightful. I'm now going to turn to Dr. Daniela Jenkins to talk about the Women's Budget Group perspective. Over to
Brilliant.
you.
Thank you, Saskia. And I think that follows on really nicely from what Jade has been talking about, because one of the things that I'm really interested in is the fact that women are not a monolithic group of voters. And actually, we know that women are more likely, actually in more recent times, to turn leftwards than they are to turn rightwards. And actually, the big driver of that is actually feminism. So the more you believe in gender equality, the more likely you are to vote leftward overall. But there is an interesting story that is happening at the same time that I think it's really important that we are aware of. And that's the fact that young women aren't just moving en bloc leftwards, but actually are increasingly polarized. Now, Jade talked about that 9%. I've got 7% from Ipsos polling back in 2024 of Gen Z, right? So these are relatively young women who are actually moving rightward and further rightward. And actually, they're not lagging very far behind Gen Z men when you disaggregate the data, who stand at 9%. So what I'm really interested in is, why are women moving rightward, if at all? And actually, a large part of the evidence around that and the emerging research, certainly moving in from Europe, is that it's the same failures of the system that are driving people towards feminism that are driving women rightwards as well. It's care about not just healthcare, but feel that the economy isn't working for them overall. And that actually, after years and years of feminist discourse from people like me, talking about all the structural issues that are wrong with the system, that actually that there is an attractiveness to what sounds like traditional gender roles that say that you will be taken care of, that you don't need to go to work, that you don't need to fight against a system that increasingly women find, even if as they're more educated, as they work harder, as they have longer working lives, that isn't paying for them. So I think it's really important as we move forward that we don't lose sight of that fundamental tenet, that we need to make sure that both paid work and unpaid work are recognized in a way that serve people's needs, because it's actually much more likely that women will move towards the margins in terms of their voting behaviors, both leftwards and rightwards, if we continue to fail to address those fundamental issues, and most importantly, provide real, tangible solutions to those things.
Thank you, Daniela. That's fascinating, and it's interesting to kind of hear these sort of two perspectives where kind of women are, as Jade said, a lot of women are sort of turning towards the sort of further ends of the left spectrum, but actually, some will also, find that sort of comfort of traditional gender roles if it means you're being taken care of. Appealing. So, quite an interesting thing to have in your head as you as you think about kind of how you kind of build a voter coalition. I am now going to move on to Ruby Herbert, and really interested to hear your thoughts on some of the comments that Daniela also made on Gen Z and Gen Z going rightwards there. Ruby, over to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I agree with a lot of what Jade and Daniela have said. I think when we look at the research that's been done into especially Gen Z's political views, we do see this huge divergence between young men and young women, and the kind of difference in attitudes that young men and women have towards gender equality and feminism, and how young men are increasingly turning towards the sort of manosphere and embracing these quite backwards views on gender roles is really contrasted with young women's general social progressivism. And I think another thing that we see coming out of this that's really impacting how young women see politics is this feeling of alienation and disrepresentation. So young women are the most likely to have negative views about the economy in terms of how optimistic they are, and have negative views towards how much they feel they belong in Britain and how hopeful they feel for their own future. So one thing that I think we really need to consider when thinking about how to win over young women is how are we kind of speaking directly to the anxieties that they have about the future, and are we addressing this kind of sense of pessimism? And I don't believe that it's all negative. I think young women still do think that politics can change, but there's this kind of lack of trust in the system at the moment, both the political and the economic system, thinking that currently it's not working for them. Young people overall see that the biggest issue with politics is that politicians aren't open and honest enough. And when you combine that with how young women feel disconnected, you start to kind of understand why they're this incredibly volatile group that are turning more towards the fringes. The other thing I do want to say is that young women do have a lot of the same top issues as, the general population, which Jade has already mentioned. But I think there's a difference in sort of what about these issues is important to young women that the polling can't necessarily always get on the surface. So, for example, when we talk about healthcare, in general, when we talk about the NHS and why that matters to a lot of voters, it's, waiting lists and the general crisis that the health system is going through. For young women, it can often be much more personal. The fact that doctors don't listen to our health concerns seriously, and the fact that we face difficulties not just because of capacity, but because we aren't even getting referred to the specialists that we should. When we look at crime, it's not just about the fact that the system can't handle the high caseloads and backlogs, it's the fact that women's concerns such as stalking and how people deal with sexual assault and rape aren't taken as seriously. So when we look at these issues that matter to the population, even if there doesn't seem to be a big divergence in what women want to be addressed, we need to think about how issues are affecting different groups specifically that doesn't always show up in the data.
That's fantastic, Ruby. Thank you so much for that contribution. I was wondering whether any of the panelists had any thoughts on how this picture plays out in different parts of the country. So is it just sort of that whether you live in London or whether you live in Wales or Scotland. And just for context, we're in the next session, we're being joined by some excellent politicians from London, Scotland, and Wales. And is there a sort of do sort of different geographic factors affect how women experience public policy in different parts of the country?
Well, as someone who doesn't live in London, I would say absolutely. And I think it's really important. I mean, I'm not working on, detailed data, because I think the sort of cultural and specific issues that affect women and affect, voting patterns in different areas are really, quite, you've got to drill down quite a lot. But I think it's really important that we recognize the fact that things like, local government, local elections, right? Yeah, we're actually looking forward to May. A lot of gendered issues are played out at a local and regional level. Whether you're looking at SEND funding, my child has special needs. What does that mean in terms of its economic impact on me, my ability to be able to go to work, being able to get decent care, social care, looking after my mum, looking after my family, actually being able to get jobs, that are local to where I live, if I don't have a transport infrastructure that's going to be able to support that. Actually, so much of what we talk about in terms of women's lives, lived reality, and how and where policy hits really hits at a local level. So when we're talking about kind of national policy, and we're talking about healthcare, and we're talking about pensions and budgets overall, for most people, what they see on a day-to-day basis is what's around them. What are the jobs that are available to me? What are the opportunities that allow me to be able to even access, economic freedom and exercise my rights? That's what's going to drive them to the voting booth. And that decision making is really how that's played out on a local basis, much, much more than what's coming from Westminster, unless, you are very close to that machine.
I'd echo that and say also to reflect on something that Ruby said as well, that we talk about postcode lotteries a lot, but actually postcode lotteries are extremely gendered, right? If you take, just to add two more to that list, housing, right? So if you're a woman waiting on a housing list with young children, it's going to be X amount harder. If you've got to factor in other caring costs as well. Healthcare, again, I mean, I live in London and fortunate to live within a radius of certain, like say, sexual health clinics. But even then, when I was trying to access it, it took many weeks. I can't even comprehend if you factored in, say, regional disparities as well. And then take poor transport, to Daniela's point, if, for instance, you're thinking about urban safety. I'm very fortunate in that I've got lots of options for last miles between my, last tube stop and getting to my front door. If you don't have that, that is a gendered issue. We really like to think of women's issues and issues as two separate things, right? But actually issues are women's issues. And postcode lotteries are women's postcode lotteries. So all of these massive infrastructure gaps, yeah, women bear the brunt of them most considerably.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't really have much to add on that. I think just as you both said, it does just come down to opportunity. And when we're thinking about policy making and how the government wants to reduce the cost of living or improve access to employment, it does all just need to make sure that it takes into account the kind of different, even education levels is one of the opening kind of gender divides in society at the moment, and women are 57% of higher education students and graduates nowadays. And when we think about opportunities for young people, there's lots and lots of talk about skills and construction and going into renewable energy, and that is great, but we do need to also think about the kind of split in how women are looking for work and how women are more likely to rely on work that's less 9 to 5. So yeah, it's just these issues are not, specific. They're not different for women, but they just need to kind of take into account how women just experience things differently.
Thank you. And so you've all kind of described a picture where there's sort of, it feels like there's lots and lots of room for improvement in kind of women's experiences of the world. Why do you think it is that we are where we are? So kind of what do you think it's been a sort of sufficiently kind of women's sort of concerns have been sufficiently high on the public policy agenda? Kind of over the past decade and a half, and kind of what are the factors that drive us kind of still being in the position that we are today?
I think women's issues tend to be ghettoized, and even just saying women's issues, people expect me to turn up and I'll be talking about childcare, and it's all about women having babies and periods and menopause. But to be honest, if that were the case, we could just, pump out hormones and the HRT and we'd all be fine. The depth of these issues, right? But you'd be surprised the number of times you go, oh, if we just sort that out, then we've sorted everything out. The depth of these issues, I think, and the fallacy is to think that women's issues are somehow separate from everything else, and that we'll get to the women when we've done with the real business of running the country. The real issue is that women are running the country. They're just running half of it for free for most of the time, right? So with the unpaid work, that's the engine of what's getting everything going. And for the rest of the time, women are spanked twice as hard by all the other issues: transport, housing, pensions, jobs, more likely to be low paid, more likely to be working part-time, more likely to be within precarious industries, more likely to be within industries that actually are suffering from underinvestment and chronic underinvestment over time. So it's no surprise that we see the fact that so many women are struggling within the current system that hasn't invested in all of the things that are affecting women on a day-by-day basis. It isn't one or the other. A good, rounded, balanced economy is an economy in which women can do well, in fact, in which everyone can do well.
One thing that I think really stood out to me that I saw the other week was, I think Crisis published its report on rough sleeping, and one of the things it highlighted was that rough sleeping among women is chronically underreported because of how the data is measured. So in this example, women who sleep rough often don't report themselves as sleeping rough because they tend to do things like stay on a bus all night or end up kind of sleeping in a friend's house when they are homeless and they have nowhere to go, but they won't kind of understand them as being part of that problem. And the data gap in all public policy issues and the fact that we don't really know how to measure issues in the way that women experience them, I think, is a big part of this problem. And then the other thing, which I think might sound a bit cliche, but is really important when you look at young women's attitudes, is representation. I mean, the feeling of disconnect and distrust that young women have in the political system means that representation is especially important for young women. And especially when it comes to Holyrood and Senedd elections, this is going to be a big issue. The Senedd currently has no young women under 30 sitting in it. I think one of the reasons that, for example, the Greens did so well in Gorton and Denton is because they ran a young women candidate who managed to get a lot of attention from young women even outside the constituency because they saw her as someone who was like them. And we do need more of that. I think it's something that's sometimes kind of brushed under the carpet, representation, because people don't see it as a kind of material solution. Just because someone looks like you doesn't mean they can do the job better. But in terms of winning back women's trust and engagement, it is something that we need to focus on.
Under 30, bloody hell, Ruby. Young.
Goals.
Yeah, I would echo all those points. It's also about representation in discourse, right? So going back to my first point about how much our politics loves the manosphere, loves the loud man. It's been obsessed with populism as it is defined by Reform or UKIP or the Brexit Party or whatever it may be. Yes, there are women that vote for those parties, but when you think about it and when politics defines that, it is often in man form. So we also don't talk about women's radicalism and the forms that takes as well. And it is utterly exhausting that when we talk about sort of anger and upset in politics, we are less interested in women because it often takes us, like their politics can often take a slightly more passive form. It's not, going to hotels and burning them, right? It's not violence. It's something that's far more as quiet. It goes to the ballot box. Not always, but that is often the case in our politics. Our politics loves violence and loudness, and it abhors a populism that doesn't quite fit that mold.
Thank you so much. For the final 10 minutes of this session, I would like to turn to the audience. Very keen to invite questions in the chat. Please feel free to kind of type something in. Is it anyone? Great. Okay. Well, I have some more questions while we wait for the audience. I just want to make sure I'm seeing the chat properly. So I think my final kind of question I have is we've spoken about the experiences of women and where things are going wrong and why they're going wrong. It'd be good to get your take on different political parties' sort of approaches to kind of tackling these issues and kind of how, to what extent they resonate, they're likely to resonate with women and kind of make sure to kind of help women feel that they're being heard.
Only to say, I was thinking about Daniela's point earlier about how these things are often seen as an add-on, and actually they're intrinsic. So wherever you have, for example, a health strategy, just making sure that I don't know that women's bodies are form a part of that, right? And in that way, sort of, it's not just the most obvious things; it's also pain. We experience it different. I think about sorry to whip out Invisible Women as often as that book comes up on panels like this, but take the way that we talk about heart attacks, right? Just making sure that women's symptoms, for instance, are considered in those when we talk about general strategy and general policy. It's not an add-on, it is intrinsic. It is also intrinsic to, say, the health of women is also intrinsic to the functioning of the economy. So just making sure that women are centered on it is not just a tacked on bit at the end of a government strategy.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think integrating, gender at all stages of policy thinking, from how we design policy, when we think about the impacts, when we think about the benefits of that, that really is the key to success for any party. And it is all to play for. We know that the majority of both men and women really sit within the center. So they haven't made up their minds yet. This is not a done deal. We can see the sort of polling trends at the moment, but really those that really stand to gain are those that speak to the needs of those that are looking for people who are going to look at ways in which their lives can be affected on a real day-to-day basis. And whether that's how that message has come forward, whether that's who is delivering that message, but crucially, how we both, use that data, but actually act on that data, I think will be the real advantage. And whoever nails that will absolutely be the people who are winning elections over the next 3 years.
Yeah, I completely agree. One point on, how we get the message across. I think something that, all parties are learning how to adapt to, and in some cases, some are doing it more, successfully than others, is, the changing landscape and how people get their news. And we do talk about the impacts of social media all the time, but it's another area where there's a big gender divide in how people consume their news. Young women are far more likely to get their news from TikTok and Instagram than they are from other sites. So young men are more likely to get it from X and from YouTube. And when we're thinking about, inclusive policy making and how we communicate that to people, we need to think about where the audience is and how we're reaching those voters, and, analysing the gender differences in social media, I think, is going to play a big part in that.
Thank you so much, Ruby. We have a question in the chat. The question is, what immediate and practical steps can you suggest to increase women's engagement in politics?
Just to jump off the back of what Ruby said, I suppose if you look at social media, and again back to that sort of very loud violence that often takes forms of social media as well, just making sure there are actual spaces where women can engage that aren't just horrific. Like, it's pretty horrific. Anywhere where there's civic spaces where it's less horrific, like the difference between, say, TikTok and X right now is, well, at least on my algorithms, is quite shocking. Like, it's just diabolical, really. So in a very practical sense of women's engagement in the debate, just making sure that there are spaces that are more considered and civic, but also that our parties consider them as well. I actually do think that there have been steps taken to do better on TikTok and things like that. It's just making sure you're not just on platforms like X, for example, but that's obviously just the social media side.
Did you want to come in, Ruby and Daniela?
I don't think there are quick wins, right? And I think that there is a fallacy to think that, if we just get, politicians on TikTok. I think the key message is, what are the messages that are going onto TikTok? How are people framing the issues in a way that actually resonates, as well as going to the places where people are? And I do agree, providing safe spaces as well. People do look to social media, but they also look to what's going on around them. And I think that that's really important. What's happening in, the people that you know's lives as well? What do you see? What do you believe is possible in terms of your lived experience as well? I think moving away from that and thinking that you can somehow be reductive to bring, a couple of messages that you can put out on a platform. I can't see that as a winning strategy for women myself. But I do think that actually taking the time to do some of that deep work and recognizing, yes, you can trust us because we understand what the issues are and we have a path to improving those. That's a winning narrative from my perspective.
Yeah, I think it does really come back to what we've been saying about integrating women's experiences into policy making, which is something that you have to do kind of across government and long term. This is not something that can kind of be put out in a couple of days. We have to, I think, making sure that when every decision is made, there is a thought and someone's saying, how is this going to affect this group of women? If you're talking about, opportunities for young people, or changing the way that we access health services, or a new infrastructure project, making sure that we think about this at every level and are able to, prove that that's something we've done, I think is really the only way we're going to fix this.
And just to add the cheeky comment on top of that, making sure there are women in the room who make those decisions. That would be good.
Yeah, we have, so we've just got another question here. What practical next steps would you recommend between now and May elections to campaign to galvanise the women's vote? I'm actually, I think that's a really, really good and important question. That is actually for our next panel. So I'm going to put a pin in that one. I'm going to ask one kind of closing question, which is sort of also just to invite closing remarks. I will say Sonia Kumar MP has her staffer has just texted me to say that there's a vote on. So assume that she's not going to be joining us for a one-to-one Q&A, and we'll just kind of we'll reconvene at 7:20 and go until 8 with the campaign strategy panel, and I'll make sure that the chair for that panel takes into account this question in that discussion. But there's a lot of we've just kind of covered such broad ground, and voters have very short attention spans, and there's only so much that you can kind of like bring through to people. So if you were to kind of, and obviously kind of, Labour has a kind of very kind of broad, in the last election, won a very broad coalition. So if you were to kind of pick areas to really, really focus on, kind of recognising that this is the UK's biggest swing voter demographic, we've only got a short campaign to go, kind of what is the sort of like one thing that the government and any kind of party that seeks to kind of win over women can kind of do in this short period of time? 1 minute each, please. No pressure.
No pressure. How do we solve it? Look, from my perspective, dissatisfaction with labour market outcomes and women's dissatisfaction with labour market outcomes breeds political mistrust. Gain that trust, you gain women's votes. And so that means that women shouldn't be overqualified, underpaid, working in precarious jobs, working in low paid industries, and really should have a route towards economic equality. If you get that right, you gain the trust and you gain the votes.
I think there needs to be a focus on as well as, I mean, I know we've talked a lot about how the material issues are ultimately so important to people, but I think improving people's belief in the political system has got to be addressed with a much kind of stricter and bigger commitment to openness and honesty, and making sure that people really can trust people who the messages are coming from. And I think when we're talking about the short campaign, sort of making sure that all candidates are committing themselves to the absolute highest levels of openness when talking to voters, I think is going to be really important.
Thank you so much, Ruby. And Jade?
I cheated and made myself go well, so I could just say I agree with everyone. But also, it goes without saying, the cost of living, like the cost of living, the cost of that is borne on the shoulders of women. So fix that, good luck. Then you can reach women everywhere. It is fundamentally a gendered issue.
Thank you so much. Bang on time. We're going to take a break for 10 minutes and then we'll move on to our next panel, which is going to consider, in light of everything that we know about what women will be thinking about as they go to the polls, what is it that anyone who wants to win an election, and particularly Labour, should do about it? And that will be chaired by my Fabian Women's Network Executive Committee sister, Rachel Bergen. I look forward to seeing all of you in 10 minutes' time.
Thank you.
Thank you, excellent panelists.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are about to kick off our second panel, which is on how Labour's campaign strategy can galvanise women voters to turn out to the polls for Labour in May. I'm just going to hand over to my sister, Rachel.
Can everyone hear me? Good, because I seem to have frozen on the screen. Thank you, Saskia. And welcome to this panel. And as I said, my name is Rachel Bergin, and I wear lots of hats, but the one for the purposes of this exercise is that I represent Community Union on the Eastern Regional Board. And when we were thinking of putting together this panel, there was an awful lot of talk of ensuring some geographic diversity. And so I know that we've got people from Scotland, Wales, London. We've obviously got Sonia as well, and I have done an awful lot of campaigning across the Eastern region, and particularly in what we would call the Blue Wall across Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire, and some of our key seats as well. I know that I've seen some people from Stevenage on this call, so that's my background. And obviously, we're talking about campaigns, and in the interests of time, because I know that other people will want to ask questions, I'm gonna move on to that. First question being, how can election manifestos and campaign strategies win for women? So I am going to first go to Sonia. And if people could briefly introduce themselves, that would be really, really good for the audience.
I'm going to start with, can you hear me and can you see me?
Yes.
Great, good starting point of the conversation. So my name's Sonia Kumar, I'm the MP for Dudley, newly elected in 2024. So first time candidate for parliamentary, but had run for local council prior to that. The Greens got me at that time, and but we were selected quite late. And then I was really passionate and thought, from a physiotherapist as my background, I wanted to leap into being into elected office. So yeah, I did a ride of the wave of the Labour polls at that time, and I was incredibly lucky. And it's luck, I think, with politics, it's luck and what the political backdrop is at the moment. So in terms of manifesto, so I know every single place will have its own local manifesto that they've put together with the council. It might be to work with, you know, the waste services, it might be childcare, it might be health, or whatever it is. So what I said to my local group is to make sure we're drawing down the fantastic wins that we've had from a Labour government. So that's 33 hours of childcare that we are talking about, our free breakfast plus a nursery that's come to your ward. If you've got like a health hub that's been set up, or you've got a family hub that's been set up, that we've got menopause pathways, and also if you've got a rolling health service that's coming into your ICB. Now there's so much work being done for women. We've got the violence against women and girls strategy. We want to halve violence against women and girls in 10 years. So it's about, I think, knowing your patch and knowing what the wins are nationally, and then drawing them down so that we've got their intertwined and working in lockstep. I think sometimes it's really easy to get drilled down into really hyper local stuff, but actually things that are really, really important for women is the 33 hours of childcare, which has been a game changer for so many women in my constituency. It's about the free nursery in that ward in St Thomas's that now people can access. It's about the fact that you can get healthcare. So a health hub, which not in my constituency, but another constituency of mine, another constituency neighbour of mine has got a health hub that's been set up. And a part of that is actually providing women's health services. So it's about celebrating what Labour's done nationally, and then framing it down from a local government point of view for me.
Thank you, Sonia. So let's go around the panel. Catriona, who is here representing Scotland. Have we got Catriona? Hello, Catriona.
All right, okay, now my video will start. Right, great, excellent. I'm here. Here I am. Yeah, so in preparation for this, I thought I would have a quick look back at my spreadsheet, which since I was selected to fight Edinburgh Southwest in back in September last year, I've been door knocking 4 times a week and now 7 times a week, and have, as a result, accumulated a lot of data about what people have told me matters to them. And in looking at that spreadsheet, I was quite interested to see, although it's a relatively small sample, it nonetheless gives me a feel for what are the issues that actually matter to people. And I noted that care, and by that I mean not childcare, I'll come on to that, but care for the elderly and disabled and so on, was definitely mentioned more often by women than by men. In fact, I couldn't find a single instance where care had been mentioned by a man when we asked them what issues mattered to them. And I thought that was very telling in itself. Childcare was actually mentioned surprisingly infrequently to my mind. It's something very close to my heart and something which I struggled with as a parent, bringing up 4 children. I thought it was very difficult to find appropriate childcare and that more people would be mentioning it. And that's against the background that there are considerably fewer free hours of childcare in Scotland, and they only kick in at 3, whereas in England they have been taken they've been given to younger children as well. So the free hours in Scotland are considerably less generous in Scotland than in England. But it hasn't been a big issue. However, in those instances that it has been mentioned, it was by women. But what I would say is that complaints about potholes outstrip all of these issues by a country mile, and both men and women hate them. But and obviously it's something that we need to fix. But I think more importantly, disappointment in what Westminster has done in the last 18 months pervades both genders and is something which we note every single day on the doorsteps. But the question is, what are the implications for manifestos? And I think the points that were made in the first panel were really, really important. That some of this is not just about issues which are specific to women. It's about prioritising issues which matter to women, and giving those due weight in the public discourse and when devising your manifesto. And I think, that the point that was made that for both genders, the economy matters, but for women, a compelling offer is to say you can be economically fulfilled is a really important one, and the single most important thing that we can offer to women. But that ties in so closely with childcare and care obligations, which still fall largely on women, or to a greater extent on women than on men. And enabling the women to work and fulfill their economic wishes is key to doing so. So I would say in our manifesto, what we should do is always ensure that the issues that matter to women are reflected there. Thank you.
Thank you, Catriona. That's a really important contribution, and I think that the thing about care being quite gendered is quite instructive, I think. Yeah. Jennifer from Wales, I believe. Please, could you introduce yourself and ask us about answer the question about manifestos and how we can make sure that they're gender proofed.
Sorry, I was muted. So I'm standing in Caerdydd, Fun and Taf, and I'm a cabinet member for Culture, Parks and Events in Cardiff. And I've been approached by men previously when we've been writing manifestos about how do we approach this for women. should we have a separate section for women's issues? And I just want to touch on something that Daniela said in the previous panel, that women aren't a monolith. We're not voting on block. We vote very much on things that we feel are personal to our experience. And so, the comments that I've made to men in the past is, please don't condescend to me or to other women by having a separate section for women's issues as you perceive them. I want to see it interwoven and considered in amongst other policy making decisions. Bear with me a second because my children are just bickering. Can you two stop it, please? Sorry. There is a women's issue. Right, there you are. Yeah, so not having care fundamentally or primarily is taken on by women, but it's not solely a women's issue. Labour have some great policies now and some policy changes around parental leave, but how are we communicating that to people? Is it in a language that's accessible? And so I think, when I'm speaking to women and men on the doors, and I've done that across Wales for the last 10, 15 years, people want you to get to the point very quickly. What's in it for me? I don't want to be bogged down with jargon. I need it in a quick, understandable language that I can quickly engage with. And so we need to be really clear and cut through very quickly about what it is that we're offering to people. And so when we're writing these manifestos, and I think it was Jade and Daniela both touched on it in the previous session, about making sure that women are in the room when these decisions are being made, that the women are in the room when we're talking about the language that we're going to be using in manifestos, and how we're then imparting that to people. And just to touch on a point that Jade made in the previous session about sort of loud politics as well, I think people have become very savvy about how they're being engaged with, whether that's how you're speaking to them on social media, through manifesto writing, and they're really quick to pick up on when they feel something is disingenuous. And I think the way to do that, and again to pick up on a point that Jade made around the manosphere and a laddie way of doing things and being very loud and brash, the way that I find is best to engage with people is to meet them where they're at and to lead with empathy. Jacinda Ardern does that very well. We have women in all levels of government across the Labour movement that do that exceptionally well, and it is done in contrast to men. And I think that's also something that we need to perpetuate in our manifesto writing, is that we're talking to people because we understand how it is that they're living their lives. We're not talking down to them. We're meeting them to say, we understand, caring for elderly relatives isn't just a women's job, but women are bearing the brunt of that, like the kids. And looking at financial security and looking at the cost of childcare, the reliability of public services, and demonstrating to people that we understand, and so communicating that through our manifesto process.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's been really, really a helpful contribution. I'm going to now move on to Sarah King, who is the leader of Southwark Council. Can we ask you to give some background and also talk about the question about manifestos?
Well, thank you very much. So I'm Sarah King and I am the leader of Southwark Council. I have been a councillor since 2014, which I think is quite a long time, but I have been leader for just 8 months. So in the leadership is a new role to me, and obviously going straight into an election in May and all outs in London. So kind of very steep, I was going to say steep learning curve, but it has been. I think talking about manifesto, I'm very conscious I'm about to launch a manifesto on Monday, so therefore I'm testing it on you. So feedback also welcome. I think there's a bit I wanted to talk about manifesto process, which is very important to us in Southwark in terms of how we do the manifesto. So we go very widely. So we set up policy working groups that feed into the manifesto process. We do a huge amount of engagement with our members. We go to branch meetings, CLP meetings. We involve our trade unions. We involve community groups in our manifesto development. I think what has been really important is actually who the people are who've led those manifesto groups. So several of them led by women, to making sure that they are the views of women, the priority of women are in there from the outset, and engaging women as members of the Labour Party as well. In terms of where our priorities are in the manifesto, I'm reassured I think, by the first session. Our big focus is very much the cost of living crisis. It is what we have been focused on as a council for the past 4 years. It is what women raise with us on the doorstep in their casework. We're also very focused on housing. That can mean very, very different things to different people depending on their own circumstances. But it's about being bold and ambitious with our council homes delivery programme. But it's also making sure that we are supporting people in the private rented sector. So that piece that's already been mentioned about highlighting the government's achievements, renters' rights, is something that we talk passionately about in terms of what the government's doing in terms of our own manifesto as well. We do talk about, there was a really interesting point made in the first session about crime. And actually, we don't talk about crime, but we are talking hugely about community safety, which are the words that I think when talking to women in the community and also to young people in the community, the focus is very rarely on using the word crime. It's very much about how people feel safe in our borough. And we are talking to that as a big priority, whether that's about the role of the council itself in terms of antisocial behaviour, community wardens. It's also very much about the relationship we have with our police. It's about our relationship as a landlord in terms of having a huge number of council estates and how we manage those as a landlord, and tackling safety and crime both on our estates but also kind of in public spaces as well. I wanted to also touch on your point about kind of campaign strategy as well, because there's obviously a really important piece about how we distill that manifesto and how we talk about it, and putting a very significant emphasis on women in our group and women in our cabinet. We are in a very positive place. We have a majority of women in Labour group. We have a majority of women on the cabinet, but making sure that women are centre stage in our manifesto and in our campaign strategy, and leading those conversations with women in our communities where women already are, rather than expecting them to come to us. So huge amount of work we do in terms of tenants and residents associations, community groups, which are often, we find, very women-led, and also making sure that making sure that we make the best of women in leadership in terms of that conversation and that listening.
Thank you, Sarah. You covered a lot of ground there. With like it's been mentioned so many times before. There's no such thing as a woman's issue. Housing is a woman's issue. Crime is a woman's issue, and actually we need to have women involved in the drafting of manifestos, and we need to, when we campaign, we need to be where women are at. And I just really want to thank you for your contribution. Hannah O'Rourke from the Campaign Lab, it would be helpful if you kind of explain to people what it is you do before getting on to the question about manifestos.
Yeah, of course. I'm Hannah. I'm from an organisation called Campaign Lab. We are basically a network of people who are interested in campaign innovation. We do things like testing, research and development, trialling out new methods and tactics, and doing research and potentially developing new tools that help people do campaigning differently. So yeah, I'm here to I think I can talk less to manifestos, less about that. I feel like there are much more equipped people in the room than me to talk about that. But what I'm really interested in is, how do you transmit that information in your manifesto to people to reach them? So I think we've heard a few of these points before, but it's really important to go to where people are. And actually, where people are is actually in lots of places, including online spaces. So I would always be looking for where are my women's groups online? Where are my local Facebook groups? Where's my parents' groups? Where's everything else? And you should just be actively reaching out to these groups and talking to them about things that you think will matter to them. And that's actually a really quick way to find the people that you want to receive the message that you're saying to them. So go to where people are online. I think also a kind of really under-leveraged method of campaigning is something called relational campaigning, which is something is much more persuasive to somebody if somebody they know tells them to do it. And that's really worth thinking about. So again, women tend to be very well networked, particularly people involved in parents groups and things. So having a good conversation can often transmit that message much further. What's really interesting is we did some research and we found that kind of newer parties are much better at relational campaigning than the more traditional parties. So this is something where Labour could definitely make up ground. So Labour people should be talking to friends and family and people they know and saying, look at these amazing things that like Labour in the area is doing. And that's something we should all be asking our members to do, because it's a really important transmission node. Because I think what it comes down to is what we're finding, particularly in this era where like nobody trusts anything, the messenger is as important as the message. Like actually, it doesn't matter what your message is if the people don't believe the person who's telling them it. And that's something that I think we've seen the collapse of within politics at the moment. So really thinking about who is getting that message out there, how are we making sure that women are kind of at the front of our comms, and actually how are we kind of thinking about things like endorsements? Like if you're getting an endorsement for a policy, like don't just have somebody say something very basic, but talk very concretely about why this has helped them. So if they're talking about, say, the childcare hours, like explaining really carefully like how that has actually impacted on their life and what that means to them, and then really clearly making that person localized to the area is really important. And I think alongside that, we've had a little bit of a conversation about this idea of like localizing. Is it local? Is it national? The fact is that most people do not really engage with things that they can't see outside of their front door. So we did a really interesting experiment where we issued a load of leaflets, so about 700 leaflets, and we did bespoke QR codes on each leaflet for each household. And then we had like 3 asks that you could scan. One was find out about what Labour's doing. Nobody scanned that. Another one was sign a petition to get a crossing at a local school. Loads of people signed that. And then the other was what should we do with an empty shop on an estate? Loads of people signed that. And they scanned that. So, but what we saw that was more interesting was the scans were all within about 500 meters of the issue from the household. So people are really kind of processing politics on that level. So one thing, you know, you should really think about is when you're thinking about national politics or national policies, how can you concretize that into something people can see and feel in their area? And it's actually reasonably easy to do. The final thing that I'd say in terms of like transmitting messages is you know, local news is shared 5 times more than national news in local Facebook groups. So if you can get something into your local newspaper about what Labour's doing in the area or how childcare has improved somebody's life or something like that, that's much more likely to reach people than a national news headline. So those are some like, I guess, concrete things on how to transmit what's in a manifesto rather than me necessarily knowing what to put in said manifesto.
Thank you, Hannah. And I just want to pick up on what you said about relational politics, because some years ago I lived in Cumbria, and actually it was a time when the BNP were making inroads. And one of the things that was really apparent was that they were really good at relational politics. And there were 2 places that they were able to capture. One was the taxi drivers, and the other one was the pubs. And so it was through people knowing people and through the people who knew people that they were able to spread their poison. And it really got me reflecting on how we should do politics differently to get into the weeds of the communities. And that I think is really valuable, and we should be as good as anyone else. I'm mindful of time, and because of that, I'm going to want to make sure that we actually do answer the questions from the audience. And the first one was the one that was mentioned earlier, which is what practical next steps would you recommend between now and the May elections to campaign to galvanise the women's vote? Are there any campaigns you recommend we could get involved in aside from campaigning for our local councillors? And I do want to make sure that in this panel that we reflect the wide variety of the geographic spread of this panel, because I know that on one sense we're all the same, and in another sense we're having wildly different experiences with very different local pictures. So I'm going to go first to Sarah King.
Thank you. So practical steps, and I think that bit about relational campaigning is really, really powerful. I think So I suppose a practical step is to talk about politics to people. And actually, I think one of the things I'm always struck by is I'm completely convinced by what was being explained in terms of people really care about what's close to them. That point about a zebra crossing is everything. People want to be able to see really tangible improvements, but they often actually don't know what a council does. So having conversations about what a council does and almost being able to explain what it is that a local authority is responsible for to friends, to family, and also talking about track record, I think is really, really helpful at this stage. I had a conversation recently with someone who, to be fair, was a Labour Party member, so I was quite surprised that they didn't realise council actually was responsible for our local parks and thought that it was the government. And actually just bringing people in and actually explaining what the different roles of government, local government are, and what I suppose is, and I don't like using the word jeopardy, but there is a bit about introducing what the jeopardy is of actual political change in that space if you are actually happy with the services that you are receiving, but also understanding and having that kind of that conversation about what the priorities are of an administration and what their track record is.
Thank you, Sarah. That's really very, very, very valuable insight. Could I turn to Sonia for your input on this question about what can we do between now and May?
I know this might sound I'm going to start with some basic advice, is actually have a mentor. So follow somebody that's already not in elections, or follow someone if they're not up for election, if you're like in Dudley in thirds. I think it's really important to have someone that you can speak to that has experience, and I think it's a really simple one to do. And even they can just show you the ropes, especially if it's a first-time candidate, about having your pictures done, making sure you do videos, have a little mini script, videos under 30 seconds, the things that people don't get taught, and it just sort of expected when you're on a campaign, especially when we hit a short campaign. That you have got pictures in different places, so that when you do your leaflet, you're doing your out cards, or when you're doing, do you know your own area? So if you're standing in somewhere that you know, then brilliant. But if you don't know, then I think starting with some basic research. Is there loads of renters there? Is there loads of people that are unemployed there? Is NEET's the biggest issue? Is what is the main issue? And there is some national picture, which I agree with you, Sarah, with sort of the cost of living. There's the standard ones, the cost of living, the healthcare, the crime, immigration. And there are really national pictures, which there's some ways you can't do a lot about. But in terms of really local stuff, I know on our stuff, we're talking about sort of getting waste bins reinstated in the north of the borough. And that is so important to people. And I know it's not a man or woman or whatever, but it's so important to people. Because if you're producing a lot more waste because you're caring for somebody or caring for parents, that is a big issue probably for you. If your waste bins are now going to three weekly or 2 weekly. So I think know your area, what the main issues are, and then campaign quite hard, whether that's leaflets, whether it's like DL or whatever it is. Get yourself a mentor so you can speak to somebody that can tell you what to do and learn your ropes if you haven't done it. And if you have already, it's not a bad idea to have one anyway. I have a mentor. And I would say the other thing in between now and the election is make sure you have some me time. It's so hard sometimes that you're thinking you've got to go this, you've got to do that, you're working full time, or you're doing something else that you're not actually doing, looking after yourself. So say, okay, what's gone really well this week? Okay, so this is my print plan. My print plan is X, Y, Z. That's gone well. That hasn't gone well. This is my social media and online. So we did Facebook ads on the state. That didn't really go well on Facebook ads. Or we've done this on on Nextdoor or in Facebook groups, and it's gone down really badly. Okay, what can we do? So I think having a little bit of time for yourself and a little bit of time to reflect is really important to know whether your strategy is working. And I would say try and grab as much support as you possibly can. So whether it's Young Labour, whether it's getting more women coming out, whether it's getting Seats for Labour out, which are really, really active, coming out, it's drawing on all your resources. This election is never won by yourself. It's won by everybody and everybody that can give you a hand, because it could be just between one vote between here and then that you end up missing. And and these elections are going to be challenging across England, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't give it everything we can, because we have got some fantastic stories, and I know that we've been criticised from a Labour government that we haven't been better with our comms, and we're not telling that story and that narrative of what we're doing. But we are the ones that are doing that. So every single person in this call should be a storyteller of what we've been doing, and we all bear that responsibility. We all carry our badges with our Labour membership numbers, and it's used. And as you know, Sarah said, it's snowballing. If you have a conversation with somebody, someone else a conversation, what's going on around the energy prices? Where's that come from? Well, you know, Keir's done a fantastic job on an international stage to try and make sure that we de-escalate there in the Middle East. So I think it's some basics, but really knowing your own area, knowing what the issues are, because if it's a particular issue, if it's a crossing, if it's renters, if it's and if you're really struggling, start with national minimum wage. That's had an uplift. It's fantastic. Sorry, I'll stop talking because I know we've only got sort of 7 minutes to go.
You covered so much time, and I have to say, candidly, the bit about looking after yourself really hit home. I think that I know that those who know me know that when I get into a campaign, I really get into a campaign, and it can be really actually quite hard to find time to have a decent dinner because you're out campaigning between 6 and 8. So when are you going to cook dinner? But actually, it's by looking after yourself that you have the power, and I think the effectiveness in the campaign, and can be really effective on the doorstep. And I think that that's really important. And I'm sure those that are candidates at the moment will be finding that really, really difficult. And I hope you're having lots of nice home cooked food by other people, but maybe not. So I'm going to go to Catriona for the Scottish perspective.
Yeah, thank you. I was really taken by, well, first of all, Sonia, thank you for the self-care message. I'm definitely up for that. But Hannah, I thought your point about relational campaigning is very well made, and perhaps we are obsessing in the Labour Party too much about the amount of data that you get from doorstep conversations, because those doorstep conversations can be very rich, but actually we're not necessarily always tapping into the right people who are going to then convey that message on our behalf to others. And talking to community groups who are more likely to amplify the message for us might be more productive sometimes. And doing I'm not saying that we won't do as much on the doorsteps. We'd still have to do that, but some relational campaigning in order to build those networks and to use very old-fashioned word of mouth between those members of those community groups to convey our message for us, and actually to emphasize our message for us, because they will give it a sort of genuine feel about it, because they're conveying it for us. So I'm definitely going to take that on board, and I think that for me is a practical next step to set aside some time to do some of that in addition to the door knocking.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I really do hope we are all doing the self-care. I do feel I'd like to cook you all dinner, but I can't because you're all over the country. Jennifer.
Yeah, I think that relational element of campaigning is a really good one, and obviously the question was about supporting candidates, whether they're councillors or Senate candidates or Scottish Parliament candidates. And you know, going out and door knocking, particularly if you haven't done it before, can be a really daunting prospect. And, you know, certainly, you know, with the temperature in the room, I've been anxious about door knocking more recently, as you know, the news cycle has ebbed and flowed in terms of, you know, what's being reported. And so the conversations that we have within our networks are really, really important. So I was having a conversation this morning with mums at the school gate about 2 new parks opening in Cardiff. I'm always wary of how much people at the school gates know about what I do in my day job. but also utilising that to kind of spread the gospel of what, you know, all the good things that we're doing. You know, as we head into the Easter holidays and the weather improves, here's two new parks that we've delivered. In amongst, you know, we've got a children's literacy festival coming up because we're investing in children's education in the city, and making it, you know, using that relational tactic, but also relating it to people's lives. And I've said previously, when I was a school governor, if you get the mums. And I know that sounds simplistic, but if you want more people to use active travel to get to schools, and we're looking at all these great ways that we're supporting families to travel to school more safely and in healthy ways and what have you, then if you get the mums and you make it easier for them. But we also have to do that piece of working with employers and saying to, you know, local businesses, we want more families to travel to school on foot or by bike or using public transport. So can we work with local businesses to be a bit more flexible about start and finish times, if that's possible, depending on the sector? Another great way to support candidates, gosh, you know, yeah, looking after them physically and emotionally. I think there's a lot put on candidates, and obviously Wales has now moved to a system where we don't just have one named candidate, we have 6 candidates. So there's a lot less pressure on the individual. So that well-being piece is, I think, is a bit easier. It is more collective. There would inevitably be one person who's kind of the lead candidate, who is kind of having to be more physically present, but they are getting backed up by 5 other people who kind of want to push them over the line. So I think that is more positive for the political system that we have now in Wales. For the Senedd system, and obviously we still have we'll still have our parliamentary candidates when the next election comes in 2029, but it feels like there's more camaraderie in this election than previous elections, that it feels more jovial. Obviously, you know, the polls are challenging in Wales because we're coming from an incumbent position for the last 27 years, and the polls aren't looking favourable. That said, it kind of feels nicer in a way as a candidate, because you can look around and you've got other women and men around you to kind of bounce off and you know, share the load with, and know that when you're out on the doors, if you get a challenging door, there's someone to kind of put their arm around you and sort of gee you on to the next. So it's a challenging picture here in Wales, and there's no getting away from that. And a new poll has come out this evening that it's not any better news for us. But looking around and sharing and knowing that amongst the membership and amongst your fellow candidates there is understanding and empathy and camaraderie, that's been incredibly helpful, whereas other campaigns, I think, have felt slightly more isolating. So I'm keen to see how this develops in Wales. Obviously this is our first time doing it on a regional, on a PR system or DeHont, but certainly from a candidate perspective it's been more enjoyable so far. But obviously we're only just heading into the short campaign, so we've got another 6 or 7 weeks to go before we get to that end date.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for your contribution. I'm very mindful of time, but so I'm going to bring Hannah in just very briefly until we and then I'm going to ask people to sum up.
Yeah, I guess these are all really great tips that people have been giving. Just concretely, we prepared some like tips for May, which are just some basic things that people might be able to do. It also contains some like tools, like kind of a constituency explorer, which helps you like map your local community venues and things like that. So I put links to that in the Q&A, so people can go and check it out if they want to. And it also contains some like evidence from some of the tests and trials that we've run over the last couple of years. But yeah, I definitely agree with what Sonia's saying. It's definitely not one to give up on. Like there's still so much that we can do, and politics is becoming more and more volatile. So that means that anything can happen, which means that campaigning really matters.
Thank you, Hannah. So in the interest of time, I'm going to give people 1 minute to answer the final question. And there is a question about national politics and how we can get it onto a local level, but I'm going to kind of in order to make it a summary question, I'm very aware that you're all from different parts of the country, and I'd like you in 1 minute to tell us what the national campaign machinery of the Labour Party needs to hear about what's going on in your manor, and can support you better. The national party campaign strategy? What do they need to know? And I'm going to first come. Actually, I'm going to come to Hannah first, and I know that you're not representing a geographic part, but I'm aware you've been last twice. I'm going to reverse it.
Sure. So I was out door knocking. We've been doing a deep canvassing experiment, trying to see if we can like change the minds of reform voters, which has been very interesting. Doing door knocking. So I have actually been out and about in different parts of the country over the last month or so, talking to people. But yeah, I think the biggest thing for me is if we can brief more local newspapers of Labour in government's wins, that would be great. I would like every win, every time a renter wins in court with their Renters' Rights Act powers that have been given by the government, I want to see that in a local paper, and then I want to see it in a local Facebook ad targeted in that area. I think if we could get that going as an infrastructure, I think it would be really helpful. So a very technical one, but yeah.
Fantastic. Fantastic, thank you. Jennifer.
I think the importance and sensitivities around devolution and how it takes all pieces, you know, I think far more than ever, each level of government is being held responsible for each other. And I think people have a far better understanding of how devolution works than in previous elections post-COVID. And devolution is really, really important to help people feel seen and heard by their, you know, their local level of government. And so on that basis, I would like for the National Party to understand the importance and the relevance of Scotland and Wales in conversations around devolution, and not to undermine those.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to go straight to Catriona. You may have similar thoughts, but maybe you have completely different ones.
No, absolutely. I agree entirely with what Jennifer said. But my thought was also that the key message that we're conveying here is that only Labour can beat the SNP. But people want a more positive offer. They want something, they want to hear what we would do instead. And we haven't quite got there yet with our messaging. We need the backup, as Jennifer said, you know, we need the backup from what's going on at Westminster, but we also need to make that positive offer. I'm very much hoping that on Thursday we have a manifesto, and then we'll have that positive offer to put to people on the doorsteps. Because the negative message that only we can beat the SNP just isn't enough. It's not going to get us across the line.
Get that. I get that. Positive offer in Scotland. Absolutely agree with that. Sonia.
Well, I recently got promoted, so I'm actually in the government now. So these messages are being directed at me. So I'm kind of sort of half taking this in a way that how do I respond back? I guess for me, if I just put my PPS side aside, is red wall seats need to be absolute priority. Towns, growth needs to be felt on every single level. It can't just be big cities and infrastructure being built into those. And I think I've had vocal conversations with ministers one-to-one and on the floor of the chamber about that. So growth for me needs to be hit every single street, and we need to pull more people out of poverty. So I think it's just a start. We've had 500,000 kids nearly out of poverty, which is a fantastic start.
Thank you. And yeah, the red wall, we have to not forget about that either. And having campaigned in West Cumbria, I completely get that. And finally, Sarah, what should the national campaign machinery know about London?
So if this had been a few months ago, I'd have said put the cost of living centre stage. That's happened, so that is a really positive thing to see, and I like giving positive feedback as well. I think I think the thing that I'd want to emphasise the most is making sure our values are centre stage in everything the government does, which I'm conscious sounds kind of quite big picture, but I think often when things I'm very so touch on something like immigration, we we experience it very differently in London. The current immigration proposal is on the doorstep than understandably other parts of the country, but there's a piece that gets lost in it, which is what is the value piece for government when it is focused on things that may land differently in different parts of the country running into an election campaign. So I think for me, it's about making sure that our values stay centre stage in decision making and being able to communicate them in a way that means something to someone outside of the Labour Party.
Absolutely. Values. I think that certainly when we're in government, I think that people see that we're making tough decisions and then forget that actually we do have values. And that's really important. Well, this has just been amazing. And can I just say, I could happily have talked to all of you for the next 2 hours, but somehow we only had 45 minutes. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your preparation. Thank you for your contribution. And I hope that this can lead to further discussions and further work to make sure that we win for women across the country.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. You were absolutely excellent. Take care.